My name's Aubrey Lyons. I'm the director of the World Affairs Council, and we're particularly excited to have a program this morning, Spotlight on Cuba, with Ambassador Amb Huddleston, who was the chief of U.S. Interest Section in Havana, as well as Ambassador to Mali and Madagascar. We hope that you have some great questions for us this morning, and Ambassador Huddleston also has some Montana roots with family in Kalispell and Hungry Horse, so she's welcome back home. And I'd like to turn things over, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, and I want to just, before we get started, if all schools can please mute their microphones, what that'll do is when it's time for everybody to talk, what we'll do is we'll call on the schools independently, but that way we won't hear rustling of papers or coughing or anything like that. So without any further ado, thank you.
Thank you, Aubrey. Hi, everybody. It's great to be back in Montana. It's been about 5 years since I've been here, and I had almost forgotten how really great Montanans are. You're not very many of us, but we're great anyway. So thank you for joining me this morning. It's super to be with you, and I look forward to hearing a lot from you. But I wanted to say really fast up front, we can talk about Cuba, which I'll begin with. We can talk about Haiti. We can talk about Africa. And we can talk about foreign service. And if we really want to, we can talk about radical extremism, because we're seeing a lot of that in the paper today. So whatever's on your mind, I'm happy to talk to you about. So let's begin with Cuba. A year ago, President Obama and President Raul Castro of Cuba announced that Cuba and the United States would normalize relations after over 50 years. Can you imagine that over 50 years we have had a unilateral embargo against Cuba, which is only 90 miles off our shore? It's the third closest country to us, Canada in the north and Mexico in the south. So this is a big deal, but it's taking quite a while, because when you have a half century without a formal relationship with a country, things change slowly. But so you know, since 1977, we actually have had representatives in Havana. In fact, our diplomatic mission in Havana since 1977 has been the largest diplomatic mission. And I was there as the head of the intersection from 1999 to 2002. And I have to ask if any of you remember little Elian Gonzalez. Elian Gonzalez was this little 6-year-old child who went with his mother and father in an unseaworthy boat to try to arrive in Miami. The boat sank, and his mother tied him to an inner tube, and he was picked up by a fisherman in the Florida Straits. Do any of you remember that story?
You can raise your hand if you remember that. Anybody hear about that? We have a couple in St. Regis. Yep. Anybody in Moore? Yep, there's another one in St. Regis.
Yeah, what do you remember? Tell me.
Yeah, let's start with St. Regis. Would you like to tell us what you remember about that? You're doing good. Just unmute your microphone and go ahead and...
Can you hear us now?
Yeah. We can, yes. Thank you.
Okay. Any of the students, do you remember it?
Yeah. Well, I remember hearing about it, and he was sent back to Cuba with his father.
Did you pick that up?
Yeah,
He was
he went back, exactly. Anything else? Anyone else?
I remember there was a huge court case about it, and there was a lot of struggles.
Exactly. Very good. Anyone else?
Oh, goodness.
Stop. Anybody else? Nope, we all agree. We're in consensus.
Okay, great. Well, how about more?
Okay, well, with little Elian, this became a huge battle between Cuban Americans and Fidel Castro. The first thing it did is that President Clinton had hoped to begin normalizing relations with Cuba. But when this custody battle over this little child ensued, Fidel Castro pricked Clinton's bubble, and that was the end of the attempt to normalize relationships. But what was really so interesting about this case is little Elian, when he got to Miami, said that dolphins had actually kind of pushed along the inner tube. And it may well be true because dolphins are very intelligent mammals. Anyway, he arrived in amazingly good condition after 2 days tied to an inner tube in the Florida Straits. And all the Cuban Americans saw little Elian as themselves. You know, they had had to leave their country. Some of their families had been killed. They had lost their businesses. They'd lost their homes. They'd come to Miami. They'd started new lives, and they thought, Elian's mother died for him to come here, so he should stay. But Fidel Castro felt altogether differently. Almost the day after, he appeared in Elian's hometown with Elian's father, Juan Miguel, and said Elian better return or else. And Fidel Castro is a master showman. He organized his whole country to demand Elian's return. I was at the intersection, which is now our embassy, and this intersection is right on the coastal road in Havana. And I had a lovely balcony, and I could stand out on that balcony, and I could watch these huge marches that Fidel Castro organized for Elian's return. And Fidel and Raul, and Fidel said 1 million men, well, it was about 300,000 men, women, and children, would march from Havana Bay down the road past the intersection, Fidel wearing his Elian t-shirt and waving little Cuban flags, demanding the return of Elian. And as you said, it went through the courts in the United States. The Clinton administration said, yes, Elian will return because under international law, a child always should go with his parents. And Juan Miguel was Elian's father. We interviewed him. It was a loving family. There was no reason he shouldn't go back except that Cuban Americans felt so strongly about the issue. So Elian went through the court process. It took 6 months. There were over 6 of these huge marches. And then in the end, little Elian came back to Cuba. Well, by that time, Fidel had built a big amphitheater right below the balcony of my office in what is now the embassy, and we called it the intersection then. And I was out on the balcony, and there was Fidel Castro and Raul and Fidel's wife and little Elian and his father. And if I wanted, I could have probably thrown a stone and hit Fidel Castro. But you know, the funny thing about Cuba and the United States is we've always been either the best of friends or the best of enemies. And now with this change, we hope that we'll begin to be not the best of enemies, but begin to be friends again with an island that's only 90 miles away from the Florida Keys.
I want to pause for a minute. I want to see if any of the students have any questions about the story that you just shared with us. And I want to start with more. After hearing the story from Ambassador Huddleston, what do you guys think about this?
What have you said back, Elian?
That's a good question.
There we go.
How old was the boy?
No?
Yeah, we do. Yes.
How old
Yeah.
was the...
He was 6 when they picked him up and 7 when he went back. He had a birthday in the United States. He's a December child. Probably his birthday's today. Okay, that's all we had, thanks.
Okay. How about St.
Maybe.
Regis? St. Regis, do you have any questions? Or comments on the story?
You know, the interesting thing about the story, there's a couple of reasons for the story. One reason is to show, you know, just how close this relationship is and just how high the emotions on both sides. Somebody is saying something?
Yeah. Do you have something to add, St. Regis?
Did you know if the boy actually wanted to go back to his father or if he wanted to stay in America?
Yeah, well, you know, that's a great question. Because I think the Cuban Americans would tell you he wanted to stay, but he actually wanted to go back. You know, it was hard to get close to him because he was surrounded so much. He had a family, cousins in Miami that were looking after him, but the cousins weren't a very appropriate family because there were, you know, there was a uncle, and then there was a young woman. She was about 16 or 17. That was sort of his mother here. It wasn't an appropriate family. And Elliot once looked up and saw a plane going over, and he said, maybe my father or something, you know. So we think he wanted to go back, but he was going to Disney World, and he was being given all sorts of wonderful toys and things by the Cuban Americans. So a little hard to say. In child custody cases, it's generally not what the child wants. It's, you know, whether or not it's a loving family. And Elian's family was very, very close, that eventually the father and his grandmothers all came to the United States to pick him up, and his stepmother, and take him back home. But this is what so happens, this story is what often happens in U.S.-Cuban relations. There's some crisis that then blows everything up. And right now we're starting a new phase of that relationship, hoping we'll get to a new normal and we'll get rid of the embargo. But anything could blow it up. So I'm wondering if you all remember some of the crises we've had with Cuba, because some of the crises with Cuba have had impact throughout the world. Can any of you think of one of those crises, Steve? Yes, not just one, but there are many.
Mm-hmm. I thought I saw a hand down there, and more. More, do you remember one that you'd like to share?
CJ. Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yay! Thank you. So tell us about that.
Basically, I don't know this one. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Oh, well, I just explained it.
Oh, we didn't hear that part. We just heard Cuban Missile Crisis. Go ahead. Again, sorry.
The Soviets were putting missiles in Cuba, and we weren't very happy with that.
Absolutely right. And in fact, what happened is that there's a great movie about this with Harrison Ford, I think. It's pretty old, though. It's something like 12 Days in May or something like that.
Yeah, I remember that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, so Kennedy learned by a U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba. They saw the missiles. And it's amazing. It couldn't happen now because we have such improved means of surveillance, you know, those satellites in the sky. But they saw, you know, one of these missiles being open, the silo being opened. But these missiles are huge, you know, they're like, not, you know, maybe 24 feet long, like a, you know, a really big room. And they had to take them from the dock in Havana and then take them to where the silos were, some in Pinar del Rio and some in other parts of Cuba. But we eventually did see them, and Kennedy contacted Khrushchev and said, okay, you have to stop this. And at that time, a whole convoy, well, not a whole convoy, but I suppose they had protection ships, a couple of big warships from the Soviet Union were arriving in the waters off of Cuba with additional missiles. And the United States blockaded Cuba to stop those ships from arriving. And this was a hugely tense moment, because would the Soviets turn around or wouldn't they turn around? Would the U.S. naval vessels fire or wouldn't they fire? And in the end, the Soviets turned around and took the missiles back to Cuba. So there was a time then when you might say we were real enemies, and the world was actually threatened by those missiles, because Cuba actually had in Cuba at that time battlefield missiles with nuclear warheads. How about another crisis in Cuba?
We also had Bozeman just join us. So Bozeman, we're talking about the different crises between the United States and Cuba, and maybe how they have impacted the world at large. Just to fill you in. So let's go over to St. Regis. Can you think of another one?
And the missile crisis is the biggest one.
There was the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Bay of Pigs. I think she said
Yep,
Bay of Pigs.
I think she did. Yep.
Okay, yes, that was the other big one. That happened about a year, maybe a year and a half before the missile crisis. When Fidel took power, many Cuban exiles came to the United States. They were trained by the CIA in Florida and then in Guatemala, and armed by the United States, and then they invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. Unfortunately, the Bay of Pigs is on the far side of Cuba, and it's also a swamp. So there's only one road in and out of the Bay of Pigs. So militarily, we couldn't have found a worse location for the exiles to land, because all Fidel Castro's army had to do was block the road out of the swamp, and people couldn't go to either side because it was a swamp. So Fidel Castro's military blocked the road. He took many captives, and people were killed, of course, on both sides, and the invasion failed. And President Kennedy, who had authorized the invasion, decided that he would not reinforce it with U.S. troops and warplanes, that we would admit defeat. And the Cubans still like to say the first defeat of North America in Latin America. But the question for you, I think, is should Kennedy have reinforced the exile invasion that he authorized, or did he do the right thing by deciding not to reinforce it?
What do you think, St. Regis?
We think maybe it was a touchy situation, because if he would have upset the Soviet Union.
That's a great answer. You know, Cuban Americans, ever since Kennedy didn't reinforce it, and with good reason. I mean, a lot of people were killed, and there were a lot of captives who remained in Cuba for some time, always felt Kennedy had betrayed them, because in his election campaign he had said, we must do more to end that communist regime that's 90 miles from the United States. So they really thought, oh, Kennedy is going to give us back our country. So they, after that, Cuban Americans always voted for the Republican Party because they felt that the Democratic president had betrayed them. But you're absolutely right. I mean, internationally, the gigantic United States, hugely the superpower in the world, and by that point, 62, we were, invading this poor little island, well, it's not so little, this poor large island right off of our coast would have sent all sorts of terrible signals around the world. Other comments?
I want to involve Bozeman in this discussion. I think you've all been around for the majority of this particular one. Do you have any thoughts on this particular crisis, or do you know of another one that you would like to bring up?
Huh? I have a question not related to a crisis.
Go ahead. Can you speak a little bit louder, Bozeman?
What are your thoughts on the lifting of the Cuban embargo this year?
On the embargo?
I think on lifting the embargo. Mm-hmm.
I would like to see us lift the embargo. And what President Obama has done so far is he's modified some of the embargo regulations that allows more travel to Cuba and also allows some U.S. investment in Cuba. But there are 4 laws, at least. You know, I think there are more, but I only know of 4 of the basic laws that are the embargo. That means the Congress and the Senate of the United States have to annul these laws. The first one is the trading with the enemy law, and that's what Kennedy used to impose the first embargo. Then the Cuba Democracy Act was imposed in early 90, and it said that any American ingredients, any American financing in any product, whether the product was sold from Panama to Cuba or Argentina to Cuba, was illegal. And then the third was the Helms-Burton that codified the embargo, but when it codified the embargo, it also codified the right to change, because it says the embargo rules say it may be changed. But worse, it said that the United States can't have normal relations with Cuba until both Castros are gone. It's a democratic country, and the official claims have been resolved. And the 4th law was passed in 2002, and it allowed the United States to sell agricultural products for Cuba. But the quid pro quo was it banned tourism to Cuba. And so that's actually a law that you can't go to Cuba as a tourist. And that's why there's special categories to travel to Cuba for humanitarian reasons, for religious reasons, for journalism, and many others, because Obama's trying to open up travel to Cuba. So what do you think about the embargo? Should we repeal those laws? Should we, can we get Congress to act?
What do you think, Bozeman?
No, you're not right now.
Can we get Congress to act? What do you guys think?
Can we?
I think we should get Congress to act because I think it's so
And come closer.
close. Like
Yeah.
how close is the mic?
The mic's right here.
Okay, I'll just talk then. I personally think it would be a really good idea to repeal the Cuban embargo because I personally think it's a policy that's been around since the USSR, and I think the USSR is gone and we need to move forward with
Anybody against it?
Yeah. Let's go to each of the schools and see sort of what we hear from each of the schools. And maybe we could even take, let's start by taking a quick vote in each school and see what happens. So, teachers, I'm going to call on you for help. Take a quick poll of your students, please. Yes for Congress or no for Congress.
Or yes for get rid of the embargo?
Right, or no for that. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Get rid of the embargo or don't get rid of the embargo. And then let's have one representative from each school report what the majority believes. So we'll give you 10 seconds to take that poll. A quick poll. I see some voting happening here. This is good. Okay, let's start with Bozeman. What does the majority say?
Yeah, we're good.
So basically everyone said that they think that we should get rid of the embargo. There was one person that didn't have a vote, but other than that, everybody. So.
Okay, good. And say Rita?
Wrap it up. Go. Take charge. We're for the ending.
We're for the ending of the embargo.
Okay.
And how about more?
I think we would like to have those laws taken away because it would help stimulate our foreign relations and international trades, and ultimately it would benefit both us and Cuba in the long run, but I don't think that it's going to happen, considering that President Obama is a Democratic president and Congress is mostly Republican. So
I think you're right. Yeah, well, thank you all, but you just hit the nail on the head. Actually, here's the problem. President Obama can do so much within his executive powers. He can't say tourism to Cuba is legal because there's a law that says it's not. But he can say, oh, there's 12 categories of travel that are legal. And he can also direct the Treasury to be rather lenient in not enforcing very firmly the travel to Cuba. He can also say that we can trade with Cuba in certain products, which he hasn't done yet. He can do more, as a matter of fact. But you're absolutely right. Congress is not inclined to do so. Cuban Americans, for the most part, in Congress, in both the House and the Senate, are pretty hard line. And they basically say, well, if we're giving up the embargo, Cuba has to become democratic or improve its human rights. And that would be great. They're absolutely right. Cuba should do those things. But the Cuban government wants to stay in power. So it's unlikely to do those things. So the idea would be that if we could really normalize relationships, it would allow more communication and interaction with the Cuban people, and that would push change in Cuba. Great answer, thanks.
well, and additionally, also like you mentioned earlier about how Kennedy sort of went back on his word against the Cuban Americans, and then now Cuba is mostly voting Republican as opposed to Democrat, where our Congress, or they would have to become Democrat in order for that to happen. Yeah, the whole thing is sort of just the conditions aren't right for the restrictions to be lifted at this point.
Yeah. Well, it seems as if the United States is getting more conservative, not less, at least at the moment. So conditions aren't right. Actually, Cuba has played a huge role in presidential politics. You know, we talked about Kennedy and the impact on presidential politics. I can make a case for you that Al Gore lost the presidency because of little Eliane. We were talking about this custody battle of this little child who was found floating in the Florida State. After he went back, Cuban Americans were so furious that they all voted against Al Gore. And then, if you recall, there was a group of Cuban Americans and others who were banging on the door, demanding the recount stop, and then the whole Florida vote went to the Supreme Court, which decided for George Bush. So I think if I were Al Gore, I would say that the Cuban Americans and little Eliane lost me the presidency.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That's a lot of power for a 6-year-old.
Yeah, it really is. So look what you guys did. Let's see. We've talked about Bay of Pigs. We've talked about the missile crisis. And little Eliane. Does somebody else have another U.S.-Cuban crisis that comes to mind?
Could we jump in here?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, is it a Cuban Missile Crisis? Is it a crisis question or general?
Okay, it's kind of a general question, but what is it like living in a communistic regime?
Oh, what is it? Well, you know, that's in a way a hard question, because here I am, I'm living in this beautiful residence that was the residence of our ambassadors, because after we closed relations, then Jimmy Carter reopened relations, and we opened relations and reestablished ourselves in our old embassy, which is a beautiful building on the coast, but we called it the intersection, not the embassy. So people thought we didn't have relations, but we did, in fact. And then the head of the intersection, which I was, lived in the beautiful residence of the American ambassadors. And Cuba was very important to us. And that residence is one of the nicest in the world. It was built by the U.S. Navy in 1942. It's just a magnificent place. So living in Cuba is a little bit different for someone who's with the diplomatic mission than for Cubans. But, you know, I knew a lot of Cubans. And the issue for Cubans is their life is so controlled. When I was there, it was actually illegal for Cubans to own any kind of business other than very small restaurants. Farmers all produce their products in cooperatives, with only a few allowed to sell on the open market. Cubans couldn't travel. For instance, I went to visit a high school in Pinar del Rio, which is in western Cuba, and all the students there were obviously from the surrounding area. But all of those students would also go to college in the same area. There was, you know, Cuba has a great educational system, but nobody moves from place to place because there's such limited housing, and it's also a way of control for the government. And so everything in Cuba is very tightly controlled, everyone's lives. There's no real freedom of assembly or freedom of speech in Cuba. And if you're in the opposition, as the human rights activists are, then you are sometimes harassed and in some cases go to jail for speaking your mind. So it's hard, and that's why there's so much migration out of Cuba. This last year, over 45,000 undocumented Cubans came into the United States. So for young people, Cuba's a tough place.
It's a good question. Thank you, Maura.
Yeah.
Any other general questions, or should we move back to crisis? Crises. Multiple.
Any of you remember Alan Gross?
Exposement. Let's do a thumbs up if you remember Alan Gross, or a thumbs down if you've never heard of him. That'll give us a little idea of where everybody stands. I'm seeing lots of thumbs
Everybody
down.
likes
Yep.
it? Yeah, okay, well, we don't have to talk about this anymore. Alan Gross was a USAID contractor, and he was handing out communications material in Cuba, and he was thrown in jail. And so the Cubans actually probably threw him in jail because before that, we had thrown in jail 5 Cubans who we said were spying on the United States. Actually, they were spying on the United States. And so what Cuba hoped is that they could use Alan Gross to bargain with the United States to get their, what they called 5 heroes, out of jail. So that was yet another crisis in Cuban-U.S. relations. For this small island, or good-sized island, but still 90 miles off the coast of the United States, it has been essentially one crisis after the other. And so right now, what the next crisis may be migration, a migration crisis. Is anybody aware of what's going on now in Central America? Probably not. It's not hitting the news that much because there's so many other issues. But we're beginning to build up toward a migration crisis with Cuba. Have any of you heard anything about this?
Again, we could use thumbs up, thumbs down.
Okay. So let me tell you a little bit. Cuba is so special because the Cuban-American lobby is so strong, because Florida is such a really important state in presidential elections. As we spoke, we can decide who is president in Florida if the election's close. So Florida pushed for, in 1966, a law that's called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And the Cuban Adjustment Act says that Cubans admitted or paroled into the United States may adjust status and become a legal permanent resident in a year and a day. No other nationality in the world has this privilege. In 1 year and 1 day, if you arrive from Cuba, you become a legal permanent resident, and that puts you on the path for citizenship. So this is a very, very special case. Initially, any Cuban, whether found floating in an inner tube, on an old boat, whether they made it to the United States, they were all allowed to be paroled in under this law, the Cuban Adjustment Act. After the mass migration in 1994, President Clinton changed that policy, not the law is the law, but he changed the policy. He said, only Cubans who make it to the United States can be paroled in under the Cuban Adjustment Act and take advantage of this special status. That policy is known as wet foot, dry foot. Now, the wet foot, dry foot policy basically has kept attracting Cubans to the United States, because Cubans keep saying, look, I have very little opportunity in this country. I'm going to try to get to the United States where I'll have more opportunity, and I know that once I land on dry land in the Keys or Miami or coming up through Mexico and Texas, then I'm going to be admitted to the United States and be put on the fast track before becoming a holder of a green card. Well, many Cubans have died in the Florida Straits trying to get to the United States. And many Cubans have left, young people like yourselves, because they think this is a better opportunity in the United States than staying in Cuba. But it's a huge tragedy, because if the young people would stay in Cuba, they could be the catalyst for change. And so one of the things we keep hoping President Obama will do is repeal the wet foot, dry foot policy, so only Cubans that come to the United States with valid visas can take advantage of the Cuban Adjustment Act. And right now, there's about 2,000 Cubans stranded in Costa Rica because Nicaragua's closed their border, and they're preventing them from moving up through Mexico to enter the United States through Texas. But if we don't repeal the policy pretty soon, this drain of migrants out of Cuba is going to continue. As I said, it's already 45,000 over the last year, and it could zoom up to more and more Cubans being smuggled out to get to every country in Central America and then on up to the United States.
I'm curious if you have any questions or thoughts about that, especially with all of the humanitarian and the refugee and every crises that are happening across the world right now. This is certainly a pretty hot topic.
Yeah, and that's what the irony is. We're talking about Syrian refugees,
Yes.
we're talking about 200,000 refugees from Africa, and nobody's talking about our own little refugee crisis right now from Cuba. Would you, we can have another poll, would you, if you were President Obama, would you change the wet foot, dry foot policy so that only Cubans with visas could come to the United States, or would you keep it in place so that Cubans would have this chance to get to the United States?
Oh, good question. Okay, take just a few seconds to poll each of the sites and then have one representative report back.
Yeah, it's a touchy question.
That's good though. It's important for us. Let's start with St. Regis. What do you think?
We are still trying to figure it out.
That's okay. That's okay. How about, is there another school that has an answer for us? This is a really in-depth subject. This may take longer than just a raise of the hand. Oh, I think more is coming to the front here.
Are we up?
Yep.
Yep.
You are.
Oh, well, basically we decided that we would have him repeal the wet foot, dry foot policy because as of right now, my understanding is that Cuba gets special treatment in the fact that their citizens don't have to have visas to come to America, whereas every other citizen from other countries around the world are required to have visas before they come into this country. And I think in order to be fair for everyone around the world and not give any special treatment to anyone else, we could repeal the wet foot policy.
Very, very interesting answer, because you were basing it on being fair in our treatment of the rest of the world.
Bosun, what do you think?
We're really conflicted still.
Have you taken a vote?
Yeah, kind of. They want to come up with a new happy medium is basically what I'm getting here.
Ah, okay. Do you have any ideas what the happy medium might be?
Any ideas? Natasha?
Well, I think we need to move to change the immigration policies for other countries, and getting rid of that wet foot, dry foot would just be a step backward. And so instead of they do have more opportunity for citizens than other countries, but we need to fix it for other countries rather than make a step backward.
Immigration overall?
You're saying you would like us to be more liberal generally in our immigration policy?
Yes.
Yes, that's what she was saying.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the issues. That's actually a really big issue with the Central Americans, because these Cubans have arrived in Costa Rica, and then they'd be smuggled up to the Texas border where they'd be let in. But if they were Costa Ricans or Hondurans or Mexicans, back you go. So it is, so either you treat everyone the same, as Morris suggested, or you liberalize your policy so that others have the same opportunity as the Cubans.
State Regis, do you want to chime in on this conversation?
So from our understanding, it's next to impossible for a Cuban to get a visa in the government that they're under now. Is that true? It's just what we...
But actually, I'm glad you asked the question. We provide 20,000 visas to Cuba every year for migration to the United States. 20,000 visas for people to come to the United States to become legal permanent residents. That was under the 1994-95 migration agreement. So we're very generous, actually, to Cuba on providing them with more permanent resident visas than any other country in the world. We provide another between 10 and 20,000 just visas to Cubans to visit because they have so many families in the United States. But what probably needs to happen, so I'm glad St. Regis brought this up, is if President Obama changes the policy, he should at the same time increase the number of Cubans who we allow to come to the United States with documents. In other words, rather than 20,000, maybe he should increase it to 40,000, so that there would be an option still for leaving Cuba, only in this case it would be done in accordance with our laws. So good answers, thank you.
We provide the opportunity for 20,000 visas. Is there any trouble? Does the Cuban government get in the way of it? Who gets the visas there?
On the whole, no. It's done, refugees, we have a refugee processing center in Cuba, amazingly enough. So people who have been jailed for human rights activities, people who are displaced. Cuba moved a lot of people after the revolution, so if they're who were opposed to the Fidel Castro government. So those people who have fear of persecution, those are allowed under the 20,000. Then we have a lottery, and people who win the lottery gain the visas under the 20,000. So generally, the Cuban government has no objection. About 2 years ago, the Cuban government announced that anyone who wanted a passport could get one. Before that, if Cubans wanted to travel, they couldn't get a passport, or it was very difficult, and they had to have a white paper saying they could leave. But now, basically, any Cuban that wishes to leave can, except just recently, Cuba said that the brain drain for doctors has been so great that doctors cannot leave. But this is the problem for Cuba. It's another interesting issue we can discuss a little bit, is that the government controls so much, and although it's allowing people now to have private businesses, there's just so limited opportunity in Cuba. And the government is very slow to reform. It's done some things. It's allowing more communications, allowing Cubans to buy televisions and internet and cell phones. But internet coverage in Cuba, cell phone coverage in Cuba is the lowest in the whole hemisphere. And the government is afraid that if it moves quickly to reform, particularly on the economic side, which should be easier, that it could lose power. So if you were Raul Castro, because Fidel Castro is now ill and behind the scene, and Raul is the head of government, how would you go about reforming your country? Cuba used to receive all this assistance, $5 billion from the Soviet Union. Then they received oil from Venezuela. Now Venezuela's oil production is down. Venezuela's government is beginning to change. So Cuba's not receiving a lot of assistance from the international community, and its economy is not doing well. How would you begin to change and reform to a more open economy from a communist economy in order to give your people an opportunity, but at the same time, keep your government in power? What would be your plan?
This is a good one. See some discussion happening. We're also getting a little bit low on time with this particular group, and what we might do is have this be one of our essential questions that we send out later to students.
Right.
And I'm wondering, in the last few minutes, if we just pause this discussion, you can continue it in class, but if you have any general questions for the ambassador before we go. I see Roseman has some hands raised. Yep. Go ahead.
Hi, I have a quick question regarding like the environment in Cuba. So I know that due to the fact that there's been limited travel to Cuba, their environment is really preserved. With the reforms of the embargo and like the increased travel, how do you think that will affect the environment there? And do you think there'll be any environmental standards put in place?
Wow, what a great question. You know, Cuba has this great environment, which you're referring to. And in fact, the Cuban coastline is a hatchery for all the fish and marine life on the whole east coast of the United States. And it's pretty pristine. If you all are scuba divers, it's a great place. It's amazing. It's just a fantastic coastline with a great wealth of marine life. And then in Cuba itself, there's some degradation of the environment, but overall, the environment is still quite pristine, you know, no pollution or anything like that. So yes, great question. We could add that to the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, what happens when, you know, all of a sudden you have, you know, 5 million tourists a year in a country of 11 million, you know, going to and from, hotels sprouting up. One of the great concerns, and I'm part of the board, is what's going to happen to Havana? It's really, I think, the most beautiful city I've ever seen, except that it's very decayed. And the center of Havana has been renovated by the government and Subio Leal architect, and it's quite gorgeous. But still, you have, you know, this beautiful, beautiful old city in generally kind of a state of disrepair. And so what happens if all these American businesses, Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's, and, you know, everybody starts setting up shop in this kind of beautiful city with a beautiful coastline, and you have people fishing and oil lines coming in and out. So the environment's a huge question, and it goes along with the issue of jobs and opportunity, because that's what Cubans are looking for, is jobs and opportunity. So how do you balance the two?
Great question. More, St. Regis, do either of you have a question?
They should allow small businesses to be able to set up so that people can make more of a profit, and it would benefit their economy.
Yeah, I mean, 500,000 people were let go from government jobs and said, okay, you can go set up a business, and some have done very, very well. But it's still a lot of people are just waiting for change. For example, when I was in Cuba in September, I went to one of these nice restaurants that is privately owned, and the head waiter is a psychiatrist at the hospital next door. Because as a psychiatrist, or any job through the government, or even with a foreign entity, the government pays you $15 a month. So he's over here at the restaurant working in the evening as the head waiter so he can make tips in foreign currency or in the convertible currency. And then I talked to the waiters, And the waiters, you know, this is their second job too. And they're all like, oh, you know, we're so excited about change. We want change so much. And a lot of it is just, they really would like to make more money rather than this standard 15 coops, the national currency is called a coop, a day. Because then they can travel, then they can buy a computer, a cell phone, things like that.
Excellent. More?
Yeah, we had one more question before we go, I guess, and it's relating to America and the future of the relationship between America and Cuba, and that is that President Obama has basically made leaps and bounds historically to restore the relationships between Cuba and America that were basically in stalwart for 50 years. And President hopeful for the Republican Party, Marco Rubio, has recently said that he wouldn't diplomatically recognize Cuba as a country even because, like most other Republicans, he believes that that's rewarding bad behavior for like the Communist Party, and recognizing communism as a good thing and stimulating our relationship there and rewarding bad behavior. Basically, my question is, how do you think that would affect our country's relationships between us and
Yeah, you know, this is the big question right now because Marco Rubio was Cuban American, Ted Cruz was Cuban American. Both of them said they would reverse the Obama policies. And all of the Obama policies to date are reversible because they're all executive policies. If they did that, most of Latin America would be furious. Latin America already put enormous pressure on Obama and said, look, you can't continue to think that you can go to OAS summits and other meetings of the heads of Latin American countries and exclude Cuba. We want Cuba to be part of the hemisphere. And the important thing about this, if Cuba is part of the hemisphere, if it's part of international organizations, if it's part of the Organization of American States, of the IMF, International Financial Institutions, the World Bank, then Cuba has to adopt the standards of these organizations, which are international standards. And that's what's really, in the end, really important, is that the region coalesce with a policy of working with Cuba to include it in the regional and international organizations, and in that way begin helping and even forcing it to adopt changes in international standards. Because isolating it has proven to be a failure. 55 years, and it's only, you know, gotten more and more, the relationship more distant and the Cuban people poor with less opportunity.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and unfortunately we are out of time. We will be sending out some questions to help facilitate a little bit more discussion in your classroom. So please help me in thanking Ambassador Huddleston for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. You guys are great.
All right, thank you, everybody.